Good evening and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. With me tonight is my partner in crime, Alex Suarez.
Good to be here.
Alex.
Good.
I'm glad to hear it. And our guest tonight is North Carolina Senate candidate Matthew P. Hoh, who has a story about how he stopped being a Senate candidate. Introduce yourself, Matthew.
Yeah. Hi, guys. Thank you for having me here tonight. My name is Matthew Hoh. I'm a Green Party candidate for U.S. Senate in North Carolina. We are actually now, due to a federal court decision on Friday, I am a candidate for U.S. Senate.
That's awesome news.
Right. But, however, there is a lawsuit by the North Carolina Democratic Party in state court to stop us from being on the ballot. And there is also an appeal by the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the DSCC, in federal court to stop us from being on the ballot. So the saga continues.
What joy.
Yeah. True democracy.
You know,
on the ballot, but they're appealing it?
Yeah. So in the federal, the federal court, Judge Deaver in U.S. District Court ruled in our favor on Friday. He put myself and Michael Trudeau, who's running for state Senate here, onto the ballot in November in North Carolina. And then just yesterday, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, so Chuck Schumer's group, filed an appeal because what happened, we had sued against the State Board of Elections because the State Board of Elections had improperly kept us off the ballot. What they did was they said let me just back up, I guess, and explain to folks what's going on here. To get onto the ballot, to be recognized as a political party in North Carolina, we had to collect 13,865 signatures, right? We collected more than 22,500, turned them into 96 out of the 100 counties in North Carolina. They verified almost 16,000 signatures. We did everything correct. We met all the deadlines, did everything procedurally right. We turned them into the state. The state says, we're concerned about some of these signatures that weren't validated. And to back it up even further, people who are not familiar with petitioning and collecting signatures, basically across the country, wherever you're at, about 75% of your signatures are going to count. So for every 4 signatures you collect, 3 are going to count. 1's going to get thrown out for a variety of reasons. Address is wrong. They can't read the name. The person thinks they're registered, but they're not registered. And that's common. That's just the way it is. So what the state did was, in the State Board of Elections is run by the Democratic Party. It's the three Democrats, 2 Republicans on the board. So State Board Elections says, we're concerned about some of these signatures that were not validated. It could mean that there could be fraud. So we have to investigate. And they ran the clock out to the deadline. And they said, we're still not done investigating, so we can't certify you. And so that's when we filed a lawsuit in federal court, because what they were doing was purposeful. It was meant to keep us off the ballot. And what happened was that the fraud that they were talking about, the State Board of Elections was saying that there's a universe of fraud, that there are thousands of fraudulent forgeries. And what happens was, after more than 2 months of investigating us, after sending those 22,500 signatures back to the counties to be recounted, you got to believe, with like a mandate to get rid of as many as you can. They found a few hundred signatures that they were able to disqualify, most because they claimed that they arrived late, or they were on an old sheet, or an outdated petition form or something. They still have never really.
It's different than being forgeries.
That's exactly right. And there's a concern about 2 people that were involved in the process, but that has got, as the U.S. District Court judge ruled on Friday, there never was and never has been any evidence that the North Carolina Green Party committed fraud. So we were purposely kept off the ballot. What happens is the State Board of Elections has a choice: either continue to keep these guys off the ballot or have the federal court put them on the ballot. What the State Board of Elections does is, last Monday, August 1st, they hold a hearing and they say, we finished our investigation. And again, they were saying things like universe of fraud, thousands of forgeries. And what they're now saying is that, well, there was, a couple dozen of this, and nothing that can at all be made to look like or resemble anything that they were talking about. So
go ahead.
So unanimously, both Democrats and Republicans on the board vote to certify us. But because we have missed a July 1st deadline for certification because they delayed it, the federal judge, Judge Deaver in U.S. District Court, then put us on the ballot. He moved the deadline. And so this past Monday, yesterday, I guess, the Democratic Party, again, DSCC, filed an appeal to keep us off the ballot. At the same time, the North Carolina Democratic Party has filed a lawsuit in state court to try and keep us off the ballot, arguing the same false allegations that have been disproved twice by county boards of elections, by the state board of elections, and by a U.S. district court judge. But they filed it anyway, and they're also trying to gum up everything by causing a jurisdictional battle between federal and state courts.
So you're going to go into the general election in November. The Democrats, more than the Republicans, and of course the governor of North Carolina is a Democrat, right, have been giving you a hard time. I had a question that first I wanted to give you a little bit of my background firsthand in these types of electoral disputes. In 2018, I was part of Canova's campaign when he ran against Washington Schultz as the independent progressive, which took part in southern Broward County and northern Miami-Dade County. And a lot of the dispute was, how they destroyed paper ballots and how they can manipulate electronic voting. You probably know in Virginia, for example, they have a paper-only ballot situation. And since they've implemented that, things have gone smoothly. My question to you, do you think in North Carolina and nationally that we should go paper-only? So if there is a dispute, it would be hard for them to destroy the paper ballots because those voter machines, I heard, are very easy to hack and to manipulate.
I think so. I think that we've had enough problems in the last couple of decades that the simpler the system, the simpler the process, the better the outcome is going to be. These companies don't make a fortune off of using. They don't make a fortune off of us using paper ballots. I mean, these voting companies, these companies that make the machines, they make a ton of money selling those machines. So, I mean, good luck fighting the money in politics and the lobbying and everything to get it. But I think certainly that paper ballots are the safer, more reliable, and much simpler way to do it.
In Georgia, they use the Venezuelan method. They print out a receipt when you vote, which I think is very transparent. I believe that's the only U.S. state that does that. But in every single region in Venezuela, I was an election observer there last year.
Yeah,
they print you out automatically showing how you voted. I find that very transparent. Go ahead.
You can't expect that in a Democratic Party primary or any sort of primary cycle really for either major party or any third party race where the Democrats might try to sue you. I mean, it's so they try to cover all their bases.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so over your case a little bit, Matthew, I saw that there was a recording, or there were several recordings. I heard at least one of actual people deceiving. These are Democrats,
right?
Green Party people, and then being told by the Green Party people or asked by the Green Party people, "Are you Green Party?" "Oh yeah, we're Green Party." And they turned out to be Democrats trying to convince them to change their registration. If you could describe that.
Right. So in parallel to what was happening with the state board of elections, and I'm sorry this is all so complicated, but that's one of the things that they do. They come in with all their resources, with their nearly unlimited resources, and just throw so much at you that if you're an independent third-party grassroots campaign, you're going to be overwhelmed. That's part of the strategy, just to exhaust, their adversaries with all the weight of the money they have. So what they did was almost as soon as back in June, early June 1st, we turned in our signatures to be certified by the state. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee showed up down here, and the Mark Elias law firm. Mark Elias was Hillary Clinton's lawyer, John Kerry's lawyer. He is arguably the most prominent Democratic attorney in the nation. I'm sure many people are familiar with him. And so his law firm, and what they did was, and we believe that working with the governor's office, and it's all very dirty, and it all connects in the governor's office. And if you think that Roy Cooper is not someone who is not going to be involved in something below board, under the table or below board, you don't know Roy Cooper. Particularly just as an aside for people who don't know Roy Cooper, people have been following the fact that the Democratic Party has given about $45 million to the Democratic Governors Association, to the worst of the worst of the far right election denying Trumpists in the Republican primaries. Roy Cooper is the head of the Democratic Governors Association. That was his plan. That was his strategy. He's the governor here in North Carolina. So we know that there was coordination, or we believe that there is coordination between the governor's office, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, of course, Sherry Beasley's campaign, Sherry Beasley being the U.S. Senate candidate for the Democrats, the North Carolina Democratic Party, and to some degree, the State Board of Elections. But what happens is the DSCC comes down here. They get all of our petition records, and they somehow cross-reference them, connect phone numbers with them, because there's not phone numbers on those records, and they start calling and texting people, asking them to remove their names from our ballots. From our petitions. What they do is they say things like they're checking the integrity of the petitioning process, but they're just making a political pitch. They're just basically saying Green Party helps the Republicans. Abortion is in the balance. Don't be the person who gets a green on the candidate and then a Republican wins because of that, right? So they're harassing, they're shaming, they're bullying. They're calling people 6, 7, 8 times a day using auto dialers. They're sending text messages which are misleading. They're saying that we committed fraud. Again, we never committed fraud, but they're saying it anyhow. And then what they're doing is as you guys were just alluding to, they were actually calling people and telling people that they were the Green Party. So sometimes they would call and say they're a DSCC. Other times they would refuse to say who they were. And then other times they would say they were us. And so we did.
They were the ones committing the fraud.
Yeah, exactly. They're the ones committing fraud. And then they start showing up at people's house, right? They start going to people's doors and doing this. And when they go to people's doors, they say they're with the State Board of Elections or the Secretary of State's office. There's a great interaction between one person, one of our petition signers, and one of their operatives. They show up on a Sunday. And the lady's like, what is the State Board of Elections doing on a Sunday? Can I see any identification, please? And then, of course, so that's what they're doing. Just one thing that they're doing. They file, the DSCC, of course, files this. They enter into our lawsuit. So what happens is we sue the State Board of Elections, and the DSCC enters into the lawsuit. They make a motion to intervene, and they're granted that by the federal judge as a co-defendant. So they enter into it at the same time the North Carolina Democratic Party is doing stuff at the state level. And then what the DSCC further does is they file complaints against the county boards of elections, saying that they didn't do their jobs properly in terms of validating our signatures. And the day that we were certified by the State Board of Elections, when they had to reverse themselves and admit that there was no fraud, that same day, that same hearing, they unanimously dismissed the complaints filed by the DSCC for lack of evidence, because again, there was no evidence. Yeah.
So I lived for a time in 2000 in Salisbury, North Carolina. What part of the state are you in?
I'm in Wake Forest, so in the Triangle, right north of Raleigh. So I'm about 2 hours or so from Salisbury. Yeah.
So Charlotte, right?
Yeah. Salisbury is southwest of me. Yeah.
So one of the things that we, Chris and I, get in debates on Twitter with people on, and sometimes it's not intention to debate, but this just happens, is whether movement building is more important than electoralism. I used to think they were equally important, but then we see these efforts for third party and independent voices, especially on the left, to exercise their rights in the electoral process and the so-called democracy that we have. And a lot of times these efforts are futile. What do you think of the importance of movement building in general? And movement building, of course, can be related also to the campaigns, right?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. Look, if it wasn't important, state governments wouldn't be doing everything they can to crack down on movements to make protesting a crime. In the simplest form, that Fox News and others wouldn't be apoplectic about Antifa. If it was
legal to run over protesters.
That's right.
Good people who were trying to run in Democratic Party primaries would not be run out or taken out or removed from the Democratic primaries rolls, as one of Seth Moulton's primary challengers experienced. He was removed from the Democratic Party rolls. So, we're sorry, you can't be a candidate. You're not a member of the Democratic Party.
I believe it. At the same time, though.
And if you don't, right? So if you are leftist and you're trying to work with the Democratic Party, you get screwed. If you're working outside the Democratic Party, you also get screwed. So if it's damned if you do, damned if you don't, then there has to be the option for movement building, which is persistently pressuring the politicians to go more to the left.
Correct. And I believe the electoral system, the political system, has insulated itself to a degree from movements. I think coming out of the 60s and early 70s, I think the political system insulated, adapted.
They have co-opted or destroyed all the movements. It's really important to understand how many of the organizations from the 60s have become organs of the Democratic Party.
Right.
From the AFL to the NAACP to Emily's List.
Right.
These are groups that were radical.
Radicals. And then they kind of sold out later on as well. So it wasn't just infiltrators. It was people that were actual activists back then.
Well,
and they got defeatism or whatever. They went the other way.
A former member of the Black Panthers and Young Lords from Chicago campaigned for Kamala Harris. So, I mean, that's the one thing. It's the one thing. But it's not even that. So you have to understand that what happened to Chesa Boudin just not too long ago is the repeat of history. The first time it wasn't a recall. The first time the San Francisco political establishment ran Kamala Harris against Terrence Hallinan. Terrence Hallinan was the original quote-unquote progressive prosecutor. He had the lowest conviction rate of any district attorney in the country, and he was proud of it. And this was not something that the gentrifying money in San Francisco liked.
No.
What was the name of the prosecutor that investigated the JFK murder in New Orleans? Was it Morrison?
Garrison, I think.
Garrison was the musician. Yeah, I heard Garrison was pretty progressive as a prosecutor.
Garrison had some issues. I mean, one thing that the movie JFK does not show is that part of Garrison's elaborate plot included his absolute belief that the gay owner of a local art gallery was a secret agent for Castro. And it was really paranoid and homophobic and delusional.
The prosecutor was closeted gay. Everybody in the community, New Orleans, even though he was closeted, knew that he happened to be gay. But what happened was the judge threw out the police report. And in the police report where they come in to arrest him, when the charges are initiated, they ask him, "Are you known under any other alias?" And he admitted that he was known under the CIA name. So he made the mistake because he didn't know what they had on him to admit, yes, I'm known under that name. And the judge threw it out so they couldn't even use it in court. So that was almost the whole case, that they insisted that he had CIA ties and was known under this other name, and then they weren't even allowed to mention it. So the judge was pretty biased against Garrison, and then all these witnesses ended up dead. So I think that if a lot of things didn't happen, he would have had a much stronger case against this guy. And there was evidence that he had ties to right-wing groups in Texas and conspired.
I mean, the one thing that you can never forget is that the Cuban gangster who was in charge of running the operations to try to kill Castro for the CIA was a man named Santos Traficante Jr.
He wasn't Cuban, but he spoke Spanish.
He spoke Spanish. He had a Cuban mother and an Italian father.
I did not know he was half Cuban. That's interesting. I knew he was from Tampa.
Yes, he is from Tampa. He was one of the first gangsters to go to Havana, and he was one of the ones who made it big. And by the end of before Castro took over, he was basically running all the mob's business in Havana for the rest of the mafia.
They captured him, and he was able to negotiate his release by the guerrillas.
But here's where it's funny. He was working for Castro as a double agent the whole time that he was running the attempts to kill Castro for the CIA.
He made a deal with the guerrillas in order for them to release him back to the United States.
Castro knew about the CIA plots to kill him, or at least the Cuban intelligence apparatus.
And they were trained by the Soviet intelligence. They were very advanced, and they knew how to turn people.
And it is entirely possible. I am not saying it really happened, but it is entirely possible that it really was a Cuban-Russian thing to get back at the CIA for trying to kill Castro.
I don't believe so.
There's no way to know for sure.
Because there was a French ambassador that was sent by Kennedy to initiate a rapprochement the day that Kennedy was killed. And Fidel knew this. Fidel knew that Kennedy wanted to start to try to end the Cold War. That's part of the reason why they took him out. So if Fidel knew this, then why would he want to take out Kennedy of all people? That I don't believe.
I don't know that it was necessarily goes all the way up to Fidel, because I don't know how it works in the Cuban system. It might be different. I know that in the the way the United States intelligence apparatus does it, there are two levels. The first level, which they try to keep at ever possible, is this is unofficial and has nothing to do with us, but this person has to die. And if it happens at that level, then it never actually goes to anybody who's a politician.
I've read books that
politicians are liabilities.
That Oswald probably was a double agent himself, who was actually trying to save Kennedy, and he became the fall guy. Who knows?
See, I don't know enough to speculate about whether Oswald was trying to save Kennedy or not. I mean, it's interesting what some of the possibilities were.
By the way, Matthew, him and I love to go off on tangents.
Yeah, no, it's all right. I mean, my knowledge of the for anyone who's listening and who's not following this, the two things I would suggest to read are, and you guys tell me if you agree or not, but David Talbot's The Devil's Chessboard and JFK and the Unspeakable by I can't remember who, but those are two really good books that introduce you to the idea that, you know, this is not conspiracy stuff. This stuff happens all the time. And there's a lot of really great evidence, including like deathbed confessions by people in the CIA.
Well, there was a girlfriend of Oswald from the Tampa area who lived in New Orleans with Oswald. She wrote a book called Lee and Me. And when she originally tried to publish it in the United States, she was threatened by the CIA. She had to go into exile in Canada and finally published it. But Lee and Me fits in a lot of the missing pieces of the puzzle. And if you see the JFK movie, you see the prosecutor saying we're looking for a woman, and that woman that he was referring to that was the missing witness was her. She fled back to Florida, and so she fills in a lot of things about what was really going on with Oswald.
Yeah, I mean, and there's just a lot. One of the things I think for a lot of us is the fact that there's still so many documents that have not been released, and things that. As what Talbot talks about, Talbot believes the CIA was involved, and a lot of it gets back to just the animus that existed from the Bay of Pigs and how they hated Kennedy for that and all that. And some of the guys that were involved were just really dirty people.
Well, he was a warrior.
Let him up to Dulles.
By the generals. And he listened to Eisenhower's warning in his farewell address of the military-industrial complex. That's where that term comes from.
And most importantly, fortunately, it's a good thing. JFK hated Curtis LeMay,
right,
and was not willing to at all be bullied by Curtis LeMay's opinion about how the military and not the president should control the nuclear arsenal.
By the way, Eisenhower was a complicated man. A lot of people say he was a full right-winger. That's not necessarily true. For example, when the British, the French, and the Israelis wanted to invade the Suez Canal after Nasser had nationalized it, the reason why they withdrew was because of Eisenhower. Eisenhower refused to go along with it.
That was because he was not willing to see agreements that the United States had made with the whole world be violated because of sour grapes. It wasn't because he had a problem with colonialism. I mean, Eisenhower was the one who agreed to take over the commitments to the South Vietnamese in Vietnam.
At that point, they were just trainers. Also under Kennedy, they were trainers. It was expanded more under Johnson. But I'll tell you this: Eisenhower was an imperialist in Latin America, but he didn't want to get involved in North Africa.
Eisenhower was involved in choosing the first president of South Vietnam, Diem.
Aware of that.
And Kennedy was involved because this is the second level. This is the higher level of things. At the highest level, the president has to know what's going on because the president has to sign off on it. So when it's something at the level of assassinating a foreign head of state, like when Diem was killed, JFK had to know about it. Those were just the rules at the time.
Eisenhower was, I believe, he was president in the early 50s, so he was the president behind the coup in Guatemala. So a lot of these presidents, they said, okay, the Latin America is our backyard. They believed in the Monroe Doctrine, whether they but
Eisenhower also
much in North Africa and Asia, but
Eisenhower was also partially responsible with the British for a coup in Iran, which is less famous than the 70s coup in Iran,
right?
But which is the one that caused all the real trouble,
right? Right. I mean, Eisenhower,
he didn't want to see Nasser turn into another Mossadegh, because when he saw the Shah took over in Iran, there was repression. He thought, okay, another guy's going to come after Nasser, is going to repress the Egyptians. It's going to be a disaster. So that could have been part of the reason why he didn't go along with the Suez invasion.
Yeah, Eisenhower is complicated. He's complicated. He also believed he believed that we could reduce the military. He didn't want big army, big navy, because he believed we could use nuclear weapons. And he also thought the CIA could do a lot. And we know that, right?
He was like an isolationist on the one hand, in that he didn't want any wars, in the sense that a lot of military people don't want wars.
Ironically, the president who invented the CIA, I believe it was 1947, was Truman. And I say ironically because Truman later was very critical of the CIA. I believe within like 2 days of JFK's assassination, Truman came out and says, "I'm worried that the CIA is going to turn to the American Gestapo." Was Truman suspicious the CIA was killing Kennedy killed Kennedy from the beginning? Who knows?
He did. He wrote a big op-ed about that. I mean, one of the things I think that Eisenhower was dealing with he was dealing with, one, he had Nixon as his VP and all the McCarthyite stuff. I think he was trying to find a balance politically. Yeah.
There's a book called America's Secret Wars, which is about all the dirty tricks the CIA got up to after World War II, basically, starting with rescuing Bandera from East Germany and sending people who worked for him back to Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it goes back a long way. There was an actual low-grade war in Ukraine between the Ukrainian Liberation Army and the Red Army until the 1950s, when the Red Army finally won decisively. And that matters because those guys were Nazis, and the CIA propped them up and kept them going. They never lasted.
Bandera believed that he was not a Slavic. He saw himself superior to the Slavics. He believed in part of the Nazi ideology as well.
Well, so it's difficult. It's difficult to decide just how much master race ideology any of some of these Eastern European nationalists really believed in, because they all believed that certain of their neighbors just had to die in order to make room for them.
He saw the Poles as Slavic. He wanted all the Poles out of Ukraine and the Jews.
Well, that was the thing. He wanted the Poles out of Ukraine. He wanted the Russians out of Ukraine. He wanted a Ukrainian Ukraine. Now, the idea of what a Ukrainian Ukraine was very, very nebulous when Stepan Bandera got started, and his party was based on the Nazis in their formation of a national vision from the beginning. But I didn't want to talk just about Bandera, though, because that's just number one. But it talks about Guatemala.
Chris, I'm trying to remember, what year was it that the Ukrainian nationalists started? It was soon after the Nazis, the 1930s. The OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was officially founded in 1929. Wow, that was really early on, when the Nazis hadn't even got a lot of power in parliament in Germany yet.
They were also officially based on the Nazis. They were already copying what Hitler was doing as far as organizing. And they carried out a lot of terrorism, mostly against Poles. No, I'm sorry. Mostly against other Ukrainians who were liberal Democrats or moderates or supported the Poles. And then secondly, after Poles. And then thirdly, after Jews and Russians. And the Ukrainians have never been entirely clear on what the difference between Jews and Russians is, which is a little weird. But that's a historical problem there. And it's specifically anti-Semitic, which is the reason they equate Russians with Jews is because they don't like Jews. And they blame the Russians for the Pale of Settlement, which used to be in Ukraine and was where all the Russian Jews had to live.
I'm sure you agree, Matthew. A lot of people that talk about foreign policy, and I'm sure you're familiar with it as well, they talk about Ukraine from 2014 on, right? They talk about the U.S.
If you're lucky. If you're lucky. Yeah, if you're lucky. A lot of people talk about from February 2022 on. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it actually goes back to what Chris just said, 1929. There's a history of fascism, even Nazism, in Ukraine all the way back to 1929.
I mean, if you want to be really, really technical, the original Ukrainian People's Republic, which didn't last very long before it fell to the Germans, who were then defeated by Bandera, who then defeated the White Army, but then was betrayed by Lenin and Trotsky.
Yeah. Bandera had to flee to West Germany.
Not Bandera, sorry, Nestor.
You're talking about the anarchist.
Yes, Nestor. I don't know why I said the wrong name. Nestor. Why can I not remember all of this? Nestor Makhno. There we go. Nestor Makhno. Nestor Makhno is the one who defeated the Germans and the White Army for Lenin and Trotsky. And then as soon as they were organized enough in Ukraine to be able to fight him, then they double-crossed him. But it was...
Had there been more unity between anarchists and socialists, it would have prevented the rise of Stalin.
Yes, I agree completely. Now, I wanted to move on to some of the other stuff. The reason I was mentioning America's Secret Wars is because it really shows the history from right after the end of World War II to up into Reagan and Carter. At that point, when I first read it, I think Bush or Clinton was still president. So it stopped at, I think the last one was Ronald Reagan, and talking about Afghanistan under Reagan and Carter and some of the
Taliban, like the founding fathers.
The fun Nicaragua stuff.
Oh, the Contras? They were a bunch of criminals.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful song by Peter, Paul, and Mary called El Salvador from that era. Which, I mean, you change some of the numbers slightly, and it works really well for any place where we have friends today too.
Right.
Friends or allies, right? But what we really have is just interests.
But
even Kissinger said that once. We have no allies, only interests.
Hey, well, that goes all the way back to Lord Palmerston, who was the original person who said the British Empire has no allies, only interests.
Well, you know, the humanitarian intervention.
We have no permanent allies.
Christians, right? That was all the British. So the idea that the humanitarian intervene in Libya, they were copying what the British already done in all times.
Palmerston said, we have no permanent allies. We have no permanent enemies. We only have permanent interests.
Well, Kissinger wasn't original then. He probably copied the quote from him.
Kissinger was copying Thatcher, who was copying Palmerston.
Interesting. Well, we interviewed, and I think before the show started recording, we talked about this because I noticed your Assange poster, which is like my poster of Assange in my room as well. You know, Garzón, who's a Spanish jurist, and you know, is part of the Assange's defense team. He's also the part of the defense team of Ambassador Alex Saab, Venezuelan ambassador. Another hero of mine has been captured, but Garzón, he became famous. I don't know if you know this, Matthew. When on behalf of the Chilean exiles in Spain, while Pinochet was visiting Thatcher, had him have to stay in England because he made an arrest warrant against him. He made a successful international arrest warrant against that fascist, that U.S.-backed fascist.
I recall that story. Yeah, I remember that story. Yeah.
So Garzón's still in the fight, and he's representing great people. He's doing great things. I lived in Spain when Garzón was prosecuting corrupt officials there. And so, you know, it's good to talk to journalists who have interviewed Garzón, like Dennis that we spoke to before. And it's good that he's doing what he can to try to help Assange. I think we all need to get behind people like Assange, publishers and journalists of the truth.
Absolutely agree. I also think it's important to remember that we have journalists in prison in the United States already. Mumia Abu-Jamal comes to mind.
Wasn't he exposing police corruption, Mumia?
He was covering police corruption. He was covering police harassment of Move. That was before the bombing. The bombing happened after he was in prison.
Right.
But he was specifically covering both police corruption and the very specific corrupt and racist harassment of the Move organization by the cops.
Yeah, they bombed them from a helicopter.
They ended up bombing them. Now, here's the terrifying thing. Ed Rendell, who signed off on the Move bombing as district attorney, was mayor of Philadelphia a few years later. And then he was a congressman, and then he was a senator. Not a senator, I'm sorry, governor of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
My apologies. Yeah. Governor of Pennsylvania. And as governor of Pennsylvania, and I'm not an Obama fan, but I think this parallel is still very interesting. As governor of Pennsylvania, he was a superdelegate dedicated to getting Hillary Clinton nominated president for the Democratic Party that year.
Goldwater girl.
Who went to every possible length he could to stop Obama from winning. Now, obviously, Obama is no Black Panther or representative of Move, but it seems like a pattern that the guy who was okay with the Move bombing also didn't want a Black president.
Yeah. I think that fits, right? I remember being a kid and seeing that, I mean, it was like 84, 85 or so.
And barely anybody knows about it. White people massacred by the U.S. government. Everybody knows about Waco. But what they don't know is about Move. Yeah. And this happened right in the middle of
you show the photo, right? And like the whole block is burnt out. I mean, they burnt down. I mean, like, and the fact that, and they just news recently, right? They had, they're repatriating some of the remains of the children because they were stored away for. Yes. I mean, that whole
they were at the University of Pennsylvania. It was gross.
Right, and so now they're being those remains are being repatriated after almost 40 years of being held for whatever reason. I mean, why would they hold it? But that whole thing, the fact that so few Americans know that there have actually been airstrikes on people in our country by our government,
and that wasn't even the first time. Woodrow Wilson dropped bombs on coal miners from biplanes.
Right. And they used planes against in the Tulsa massacre.
I never knew that about the Tulsa massacre.
I'm sorry?
I never knew they used planes during the Tulsa massacre.
Yeah, they dropped bombs from airplanes.
Yeah.
It was civilian planes in that case and homemade bombs, but it was still
Black Wall Street, the decimation of the economically successful African American community there.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that was the continuation of the post First World War crisis.
Red Autumn.
Yeah,
when people were coming back from World War I, and white mobs were killing black men in uniform was how it started, and then it became just really horrible race riots where black neighborhoods were massacred.
Who predicted was going to happen in Tulsa was Du Bois, who was a very known African-American intellectual at the time, later became a socialist. Du Bois was critical of Booker T. Washington because he said, African-Americans go to vocational colleges. They should go into higher education as well. Du Bois went to Harvard. I believe he was the first African-American to graduate from Harvard. But he said at the same time, if you don't have laws that are passed for the authorities to protect African-Americans, it doesn't matter how successful they become, that they're going to end up being massacred. And he said that within, a couple of years before the Tulsa massacre. So Du Bois saw it coming.
Well, I mean, it wasn't the first or the last time. I mean, what nobody ever talks about is how the worst riots of the 60s were police riots. The reason that Watts happened was because a violent cop got attacked,
right?
And that spread off the riot. Detroit, same thing.
That's at Newark. Newark was that way. The cops beat a taxi cab driver in Newark, and then the cops in Newark, they had to send the National Guard in to stop the cops in Newark. That's why they send the National Guard into Newark.
So there's a history.
The whole thing is just crazy.
Whether it's black people or working people, there is a history of private industry or a private racist group doing something horrible and then really having it go badly for them and needing to be saved by the government who comes in and completes it for them. One of the really first classic examples is the Johnson County War, where the big landowners of Wyoming decided to get rid of all the homesteaders who had smaller ranches or worse, farms. And so they just called them all rustlers and outlaws and sent people to kill and lynch them. And the farmers and ranchers defended themselves and were winning. And the hired gunfighters got chased up into the mountains and had to be rescued by the U.S. government, who had to put down the uprising when it was just people defending themselves from hired guns brought in to chase them out.
I believe it was 1917 when the Espionage Act was first started during World War I, and it was a means to go after dissenting voices against the war, such as Eugene Debs, who ran for president of the Socialist Party from the jail cell and got 1 million votes back then with how small the population was as comparison to today. And that's without not being able to campaign. He was behind bars under the Espionage Act. And, you know, when you describe these things to certain people that don't appreciate history, they say, well, what does that have to do with today? Literally, Assange right now is being the Espionage Act. It's been around for over 100 years. I believe they used it against Ellsberg at the Pentagon Papers. You know, so they use it against whistleblowers. Now they're using it against a publisher. They use it against the political figure of Eugene Debs, speaking out against entering World War I. And, you know, that's why it's important to learn history. It's important to understand laws, and important to understand the reversal of laws or how to keep them in place if they're just laws, such as Roe. Roe was not codified. And you, as a Green, Matthew, understand that the Democrats had a half a century to fight to get it codified. It didn't happen.
Well, let's remember.
Fundraise.
People don't remember this. And so I'm going to speak up and say it again just to repeat it. I like to say it at least once a show if I can. At the time that Roe passed, the Democratic Party was more on the record against abortion than the Republicans, and most Republicans were probably for it. And the reason for this was that the Democratic Party was the official political party of American Catholics. And American Catholics were the majority of the people in the anti-abortion movement at the time.
Yeah.
The Southern Baptist Conference, by contrast, made quietly pro-Roe noises in 73 and officially endorsed it in their conferences in both 74 and 75. The year that the Roe decision was made, the outgoing president of the Southern Baptist Conference said he thought that it was really important for poor women in the country to have the right to terminate their pregnancies, because otherwise they would be trapped in marriages with men who did not care about them.
And not everybody that supported abortion was progressive either. You had people from
this guy wasn't progressive.
Right.
He wasn't progressive. He just wanted people to be able to get out of a marriage if they were getting beat up.
Also, conservatives always say we don't want the government to intervene in our personal affairs. They figured in the 70s, how we get the Christian right vote. Let's say except when it's a woman's body. Oh, then they can get the Christian right vote.
And this is where you see the big pivot, where a group of evangelical Southern Baptists and a smaller group originally of Catholics turned evangelicals sort of got together and said, look, we're going to lay off being so anti-Catholic and identifying ourselves as Protestants all the time. And instead, we're going to call ourselves Christians and go after liberalism and tell the Catholics they're welcome to come along with us because you know they will.
Hmm.
And the result was a few years later, Ronald Reagan, who was, it should be noted, a lapsed Catholic turned zealous evangelical, who ran for president on one of the first anti-abortion platforms in 1980.
You know, there's a lot of intersection that goes on throughout the 70s into the 80s that creates the political reality we have now. You know, one of the things I go back to is 68 and George Wallace running a third party run. And he gets, what does he get, like 10%, 11% of the vote, I think, or something like that? I don't know. Maybe it wasn't that high. But
you're talking about he was the VP for a very short amount of time of FDR, right?
No, George Wallace was
Henry. That's Henry Wallace, totally different person.
Exactly.
George Wallace bad, Henry Wallace good.
About George Wallace, who was a racist governor.
Yes, that's George Wallace. Yeah. So in 68, he runs his own campaign. He runs against Nixon and Humphreys. And I have to look up.
The American Independent Party.
Yep.
His running mate was Curtis LeMay, who I was talking about before.
Exactly.
Who believed that the military and not the president should have control of the nukes.
Right.
So because about what Chris said earlier about the Protestants is the word Protestant means a protest against the Catholics. Protestant protest. And you know, then they work together, and actually they're working together with the Zionists now too, aren't they? The evangelicals. They like different
so Christian Zionism is complicated. Christian Zionism is focused on two closely linked things. One is prophecy, and the other is the idea of the invisible church. The prophecy is fairly straightforward. The prophecy says, as they understand it, the Jews have to all go back to Israel and start the new and settle Jerusalem again and establish a new Jewish state so that they can all be wiped out by their neighbors and the apocalypse can start.
Which is an anti-Semitic thing, but they're pro-Zionist at the same time.
It's really anti-Semitic, but the whole thing is if you are a Zionist and you don't believe that this apocalypse is going to happen the same way these religious zealots do, you're happy to take their help and call them stupid behind their back.
And Biden called himself the Catholic Zionist.
Don't get me started. So the second is more important and not talked about enough. The second is the very important Calvinist idea of the invisible church. Now, the visible church is just what it says. All the Reformed or Baptist churches in the world that claim some degree of Calvinist predestination and Calvinist sense of the elect. However, on the sense of the invisible church is all of the Christian elect plus a remnant of the Jews who have been chosen to be among the elect, even though they are not Christians. Because there's a bit in Revelation that talks about how a remnant of a remnant will be saved in relation to the people of Jerusalem. And so the invisible church idea in Calvinism, very condescending. There's nothing loving or accepting of Judaism about it. It's just this condescending idea that a remnant of a remnant will be saved from the Jews too, as part of the invisible church, whether they really know they're Christians or not, because God's decided they're Christians and they don't get to choose otherwise. And when you say it out loud, it's ridiculous.
It's insane.
But the discussion of the invisible church versus the visible church is an important point of Calvinist theology. It's one of the formative things. And so when you talk about Christian Zionism, you have to think about this idea of the invisible church and how it relates both to the prophecies that everybody knows about and just to the idea of wanting to have some of the elect in charge in Israel. And of course, they've decided they know who the elect are.
Most Zionists outside of Israel identify themselves as Christian, especially the younger Jews that tend to be more on the left. They're rejecting the Zionist identity, a lot of them.
Right. Yeah. I feel like I meet more Zionists that are evangelical Christians than I meet who are Jewish, Now,
yeah. It is important to acknowledge that the Jewish Defense League, which is based in the United States, they have headquarters in both Los Angeles and New York. They were originally based in New York City, and then they switched to Los Angeles, and then they decided they were going to be based in both.
They're not the ADL. You mean the JDL, right?
The Jewish Defense League, the JDL. Very different from the ADL.
Very different. Yeah.
The Jewish
I've run into those guys at pro-Palestine rallies or anti-AIPAC rallies too. Yeah.
Even more importantly, the fact that they and organizations linked with them are tremendously important in finding people to volunteer to go to Israel, to the West Bank, to be settlers, or to Palestinian parts of Israel proper and to be settlers.
So you're saying that JDL is a full-blown Zionist organization?
The JDL is a full-blown Zionist organization. Their original founder moved to Israel from New York and became deeply involved in Israeli politics, and his political party was banned because he was considered too right-wing and scary and terroristic for even the ex-terrorists who ran the Israeli government.
Israeli Connected, right?
But yeah, no, he was. These were people who were considered too right wing for the terrorists in the Knesset. Yes.
Yeah, I saw those guys beat up an old Palestinian man in D.C. in 2017, and then certainly I've been to Palestine and had run-ins with settlers there, and even too with the Israeli army. When you're in the West Bank, a lot of the most forceful and aggressive members of the Israeli army you're going to run into are Americans.
Well, Naftali Bennett, who was prime minister until not too long ago, and who may win again, who knows? We don't know what the next elections are going to look like. But Naftali Bennett's parents were Americans who were hooked up with a settler organization by a program at the Jewish Defense League, who came to Israel in order to settle Palestine.
I heard Bennett was to the right of Netanyahu.
Oh, absolutely. No, so here's the scary part.
Yeah.
The guy who's prime minister now, he's just a lame duck placeholder until the next elections. The Knesset's been prorogued and isn't meeting until after the next elections. The guy who's prime minister now is the alleged centrist. The alleged centrist says he's for a two-state solution, but wants a completely demilitarized Palestinian state. So the centrist position in Israel, in Israeli politics at this moment, is to transform Palestine into a literal Bantustan and to make apartheid even more legal and formal.
I don't call it a war because the Palestinians already have been demilitarized.
Even as they deny that Israel is an apartheid state, the centrist position in Israel, the so-called two-state solution for peace, is a formalizing of a permanent South Africa-style apartheid state for Palestine subject to Israel.
Yeah, and it took him all of 3 weeks to attack Gaza? 4 weeks maybe he's been in office now?
Yeah, and he's the centrist. Yeah, he's the centrist.
I mean,
they start attacking to distract. They start provoking in order to distract from their own domestic issues, kind of like Pelosi did recently with their Taiwan visit.
Yeah, and they've got elections coming up, as Chris was saying, in November, I think. And to be to win, you have to kill Palestinians. You've got how you prove your chops. That's how you prove you can be an effective head of government, is to kill Palestinians.
I remember when they threw out Zippy Livni, who was by no means a pacifist. She presided over a really nasty war in Gaza while she was prime minister for that. But all that aside, they threw her out for being too soft on Palestine and too pro-peace.
A lot of people that claim that Israel's a democracy because they have the Ballot party, which is basically the Israeli Arabs or historic Palestinian party. They harass their members all the time, and their family member Ajmi Bashara was exiled. One of the other members of Ballot, I forget her name, she attended the flotilla back in 2010 to try to bring humanitarian to Gaza as a member of parliament. She's been discriminated against. So they have these groups that are in the Knesset just to say, oh, they exist, we're a democracy. But they're not treated like, a senator or a congressperson would be here in the United States.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've met with Israeli Arab or Israeli Palestinian, Israeli Arab members of the Knesset in the Knesset, 2 women, and this is several years ago, and they say clearly this is not a democracy. Even though we're sitting here with you guys right now, and we are MPs and we are members of this institution, this is not a democracy. This is all a sham. We're doing what we can, but yeah, this is a sham.
People get mad at me when I say this. But if you go by things like proportional representation of minorities in parliament, Iran is more democratic than the United States.
Right.
Yeah, we talked about it on Twitter the other day. In Iran, if you're a transgender person and you request from the government to help you in your transition to do a sex change, they'll cover your costs for that for free. So, yes, the Iranian religious government is homophobic, but they make exceptions with transgender people and things like that. So it's a lot more complex than what they're trying to portray it.
It's also important to understand that, yes, there is a theocratic establishment in Iran that under the Iranian constitution can take control of the state in a variety of ways at any time. However, that has become much more subtle than it was when I was a kid, and Ayatollah Khomeini was on the news all the time.
Yeah.
How often do you ever see the guy who's Ayatollah now? Khomeini is his name. Mm-hmm. How often do you ever see him on the news personally? Every now and then. But, I mean, they were really trying to scare us.
The funeral of Soleimani in 2019, that was probably the last time he appeared publicly.
And they were trying to really scare us with President Ahmadinejad for a while.
Right.
Make him a real cartoon bad guy.
Well, Ahmadinejad is the one that started the friendly diplomatic relations between Venezuela and his government.
He also
anti-imperialist. The Iranians still have very good relations with Venezuela.
He also lost his re-election. And then we undermined his much, much, much more liberal replacement by making a deal with him on their nuclear program, and then electing a president who fucked him over.
Right. And then they elected it, and then they removed Rouhani, and they elected a more hardline guy. It's almost as if the hardliners there get together with our hardliners, and they say, this is what we're going to do. And this is going to make things, and eventually we're going to get the wars we want, because they have their hardliners too.
Well, the Trump regime pulled out of the Iran deal, but guess who's not re-entered it? Biden. Biden has stepped up all these Trump policies and made some of them worse, by the way. He made new sanctions against Nicaragua. He made new sanctions against Cuba. So he's betrayed his own legacy with Obama, the easing of restrictions on Cuba. He's not the Iran deal that Obama took part in. And like Chris said, I'm not an Obama fan either, but these are just truths. Biden is full right wing, copying Trump and being worse than Trump on foreign policy issues.
Right.
I mean, let's not forget that Biden was the guy who said, so Obama and Biden had a meeting with all these consultants from the Beltway and the West Coast to talk about the border issue early in Obama's presidency. And the solution was a system of expanded border jails that gave us the kids in cages that everybody remembers from both Obama and Trump's legacy.
Yeah, there wasn't as many kids cages as under Trump, but it first happened under Obama.
Yeah.
And more than that, there was a meeting and several decisions were offered, and Obama specifically went with the build cages option. Well, we can't forget that. This was the option that the U.S. government chose. Let's build cages. So that's number one. Then number two, Biden was the guy in the room who said, and let's make it a payday for our friends in the private prison industry. Because that's the Delaware.
Think about it. Everything's related, right? So I think we talked about it on a prior show. Let me tell Matthew. Why is there arrest quotas? My theory why there's arrest quotas is because private prisons in most U.S. states at this point, I believe, have a right to sue the state for not giving them enough prisoners. Therefore, it pressures the governors to pass these laws to justify the arrest quotas.
Well,
so they can keep up those prisoners.
I wanted to spell one myth right away, which is the idea that private prisons are the problem.
They're part of the problem.
Well, but the real problem is that our whole prison system is deeply compromised by capitalism. And it doesn't matter if it's private or not. Our entire prison system is still for profit. If corporations are not openly profiting from it by running the prison, they are profiting from the cheap labor they get from prisoners.
Right, where slavery is legal.
Yes.
Yeah, people don't know it. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars a year in prison labor.
Yes, half the stuff made in the USA, maybe more.
Even juvenile detention centers that are for-profit detention centers.
Cash for kids.
There is the judge to round up those kids, usually people of color and poor working class communities, and put them in those centers as well.
The cash for kids scandal in Pennsylvania, 2 federal judges went to prison.
That was part of the system. They need to find a couple fall guys when it got revealed.
They were specifically being bribed by the corporation that ran most of the facilities in the state of Pennsylvania's juvenile system. This corporation made more money off of because their basis was based on full beds. So the more full cells they have, the more beds and cells are occupied, the more money they're getting from the government. So they're always trying to keep these facilities full.
That's the insanity of everything being for profit, nothing being health.
So they were literally bribing judges to throw the book at kids and sentence kids to serious time in the juvenile system over, ridiculous stuff that wasn't worth 5 years in the system. A kid got 5 years for truancy because he was late a few days for a week because his mom's car broke down and he didn't drive.
Yeah, they don't fund the buses to these communities.
We're not even talking.
They get in trouble.
We're not even talking. He went to jail for truancy because he missed a whole bunch of school. He went to jail for truancy because of tardiness, basically.
Well, this goes back to what you guys were talking about earlier about why history matters. If you look at the evolution of the prison system in the United States, and it's the most prominent roots in the late 19th century, what are we talking about? We're talking about convict labor. We're talking about during the Reconstruction period, but also throughout the North, the use of prison labor. To not just enrich companies, but also to stifle black folks, to oppress, in the South, it was just a replacement for the slave system, but throughout the whole country, it was utilized in order to maintain a hierarchy, a racial hierarchy, and those are the most fundamental roots of our modern prison system.
The school to prison pipeline, whether you call it the school to prison pipeline or whether you call it racial profiling in neighborhoods, whether you call it unequal policing of communities, there are all these ways by which we make sure that black people are in prison out of proportion to their percentage of the population.
Right.
And what do most states have? most states have some sort of law restricting or stopping the voting of felons, at least while they're in prison or on parole or on probation. Some take your rights to vote for life. My wife was amazed when she could vote in Oregon because she thought all her life that because she couldn't vote in Florida, she couldn't vote anywhere else either.
We just had here in North Carolina re-enfranchisement of felons.
Yes.
So it's a big victory here in North
They have a
Carolina.
poll tax here in Florida. So they passed it, but then they got the poll tax to prevent them from exercising their rights.
Yeah, there was a lot of skullduggery after that passed by the legislature and the governor, and it's just wrong. Everything they could to preempt that. Because, of course, they're worried about losing elections to Democrats because of it.
Gerrymandering is going on all the time. There was a district that included here in Jacksonville and parts of Tallahassee, mostly African American, mostly Democrat, and the Republicans successfully got the more right wing areas split off from it so they could get more votes. They're gerrymandering all the time.
Well, the city of Palo Alto in California is Stanford University, some student housing, a country club and all the country club housing, a really nice mall and a really nice neighborhood around the mall from the country club. And then the rest of that whole area is still unincorporated. So the city of Palo Alto is this tiny corner of what used to be called Palo Alto. And it's all rich white people who have some connection to Stanford University.
Because the demographics don't make sense. You have a lot of people that are minorities that don't want to vote necessarily Republican or right wing population centers. But why do the elections end up as they are? Because they're rigged that way, you could say.
I'm going to speak explicitly, though. The city limits of Palo Alto were specifically formed the way they were formed to keep out poor people, black people, and Mexican Americans. Those are the people whose neighborhoods were excluded.
In the 1950s, they deported several Mexicans, including Mexican Americans born in the United States. And then you had something similar happen when Trump prevented, on the Texas border, Americans born in Texas of Mexican descent from being able to renew their passports.
All sorts of skullduggery.
Yeah.
The history of the U.S.-Mexican border is yet more proof that we have no sort of democratic values.
The Southwest U.S. mostly exists because of slavery. That's what was said at the time. They said we need this land from Mexico to have more land for slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. There was a belief they thought they were going to grow cotton in New Mexico, which is kind of funny if you think about it now, but they really did think they were going to grow cotton in New Mexico. They thought they were going to grow cotton in Arizona, which is even funnier. California is an agricultural state, but not in the way they thought. I don't think they ever planned to grow cotton in California. But
this revisionist history, right? Also about the Civil War. Just look at what the Confederate leaders said. They all said universally that we're doing this in order to protect the slaves.
They had plans for conquering Mexico and Cuba.
When they're here trying to protect their Confederate statues, they revised it completely what the history was. They called it the Northern War of Aggression. This is what they teach schools here.
The Confederates had plans for conquering Mexico and Cuba after defeating the United States and securing their independence. Well, it was on the list.
Oh, the Confederates wanted to be imperialists too. That's true.
Yes, yeah. They wanted to make slave states.
A lot of the Confederates went to Latin America afterwards. They went to Brazil, which was one of the last countries that still had slavery.
Yeah, and a lot of Confederate veterans right away went south immediately after the war to fight for Maximilian, where some of them survived and lived on in Mexico, and others got hung by Benito Juarez, which is,
slavery was illegal in Mexico then, but the French were trying to take over Mexico. I did not know the Confederates were fighting for the French, though. That's interesting. Ben Thompson, who was a famous
gunslinger slash gambler slash lawman and contemporary of Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, who's less famous now than he was then, and they're more famous now than they were in their own times. So it's kind of funny. But famous gunfighter, largely got his combat experience after the Civil War, because he joined up too late for any of the big battles. After the Civil War, he got his combat experience in Mexico on the losing side, fighting for Maximilian.
Mm-hmm.
And
the idea of the United States,
Puebla, where Maximilian was defeated, correct? Which is on the 5th of May.
Well, the 5th of May is the specific battle and death of the kids, the cadets.
Well, Maximilian's army was defeated then.
Yes, but I think the actual battle lasted longer and wasn't just the 5th of May. But I could.
It was in Puebla. I heard that they were outnumbered. That there was more French troops than Mexican, but they were still able to defeat them.
Well, part of it was the kids held out until they all died, which no one expected.
Mm-hmm. They were the kids of Maximilian?
No, the kids fought for Juarez. The kids were from the military academy.
The Mexican cadets. There was a big sacrifice in order to fight the French.
That's what the Cinco de Mayo holiday is about. The kids.
It's not a Saturday day, but it was an important battle day. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge holiday for Mexican Americans. It's not so big in Mexico. Why it ended up a huge holiday for Mexican Americans and not Mexicans, I don't know. But that's how it ended up.
I thought you knew everything, Chris.
I don't know that one. I can't explain that one.
The idea of wasn't Alexander Hamilton wanted to send an army south, if I remember right, if I'm thinking of, if I've got this right, and take Mexico. I mean, in Cuba was something that they fantasized about all throughout the 19th century.
Alexander Hamilton, not so much. I don't think. The one that what I remember the most is the various attempts under Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan for various illegal groups that's left the United States in small groups intending to recruit larger armies in places like Nicaragua and Cuba, came to very bad ends.
Yeah, they called those guys filibusters, right? Weren't they called filibusters? Yeah.
That's where our filibuster comes from, is these guys who were just outright bandits and pirates and crooks trying to sneak across borders to raise armies to overthrow neighbors so that they could have slaves.
Yeah.
And when the Trump
filibuster comes from,
it was the first time in a long time the United States actually admitted, because they always distance themselves from the Monroe Doctrine. Oh, we don't see Latin America as the backyard, right? There's been a few sections here or there, but actually they were openly admitting, Pompeo during the Trump regime said, "Oh yeah, we want to bring back the Monroe Doctrine." So at least they were being less hypocritical than prior administrations, especially the Democrats. But
Biden's position on Venezuela is the same as Trump's.
Right.
I'm sure Biden's position on Iran is more militant than Trump's. Biden's position on China and North Korea is more militant and aggressive than Trump's.
Part of it is what does a businessman do? A businessman negotiates. That's all they do.
Well,
so
Trump
I'm not trying to talk nice about Trump.
It's debatable how much of a businessman Trump is. but
if he got a second term, he might have entered an Iran deal eventually. Who knows? He did have a lot of hardliners in his regime, though.
Trump is someone who likes to think of himself as a
well, a lot of it was his inheritance. It wasn't his business
maker. But he's an ad man. I mean, and that's the worst thing is Trump is an ad man and not a very good ad man.
Right.
He's only good at the only thing he knows how to sell is himself, and he can't find a new way to do it. It's always the same way. The trouble is that people in America really eat up the idea of rich people.
Well, yeah, they hate to see a mansion raided, right? Like we saw recently.
You know, I would find it a lot. I would be a lot more convinced that the Republicans really wanted to defund the FBI if they weren't criminals. I mean, the Democrats are criminals too, but they want to give the cops more money than ever.
They were saying "fuck the police" on January 6th. They killed officers. Some of them tried to use Antifa as a scapegoat.
There's some interesting scenes in that. There's some interesting scenes in that documentary, though, where you hear people on tape say things like, "You're supposed to be on our side," as they realize the cops aren't going to just join up with them. Now, it's really important to understand that if it were the other way around, if there were some sort of protest that marched on the Capitol in that way, composed of not even socialists, composed of Elizabeth Warren supporters, if a crowd of Elizabeth Warren supporters marched on the Capitol with the cops out there like that, and a bunch of Trump supporters came out and started killing them, the cops would be cool with that. It's really important that you understand that the cops would be cool.
To me, Elizabeth Warren's not even remotely.
Trump supporters killing any sort of liberal or progressive or socialist or communist activist right in front of them.
Yeah, well, there's a century of that, right? There's a century of that.
Yeah. All you need to do is look at Rittenhouse. They patted him on the back and let him go after he shot those people.
Right.
There's a simple comparison. Two cases bookend each other very nicely. Michael Reinl in Portland, Kyle Rittenhouse in Wisconsin. Michael Reinl never even got a trial. He shot a Nazi defending protesters and himself and was murdered by U.S. Marshals.
He was Antifa, right?
He was Antifa. He was there at a protest specifically to protect people from Nazis, which he did successfully. And he was murdered for protecting people from Nazis. On the other hand, Kyle Rittenhouse murdered two people who were protecting people from him, a Nazi, and wounded a third. And he has become a hero to certain segments of the right and was treated really nice by the local cops.
Yeah, he was able to flee the state. He was let go. And finally, when the footage came out, then they went and they extradited him back to Wisconsin and arrested him. But the cops liked what he was doing.
Yeah, the cops were like high-fiving him before and after. It's not cool.
Well, they were thanking those guys for showing up to help, and that happened across the country where the police were thanking those types of guys.
Here, I live in Portland. Our former police chief in Portland was fired because her or resigned. It's complicated. I say fired because there was displeasure and she lost her job, but she would probably say she resigned, whereas the city might say they fired her. Is those sorts of disputes. But the police chief who lost her job here because her cops were too friendly with the very Nazi organization, Patriot Prayer, that the guy Michael Reinl killed later belonged to. Funny coincidence that. Her cops were too friendly with them, so she lost her job. Now she's police commissioner in Philadelphia, where the notoriously white supremacist cops did the move bombing.
Yeah. All comes around, right?
It all comes around.
It all comes around.
And this is why it's not just, taking people off. The Democratic Party suppresses other parties by taking third-party people off ballots.
Can I give another example of a case?
Sure.
So Marissa Alexander, a few years ago when I lived in Tampa, she actually is from here in Jacksonville. I wrote an article in the college paper about this. So Marissa Alexander was an African-American woman who was being abused by her ex-husband, and she felt threatened for her life. She didn't shoot him. She got a gun, and while he was strangling her and she had the gun in her hand, she fired in the air. Didn't hurt anybody. And she got sentenced to 20 years. And the same prosecutor that went after her was the one overseeing the Zimmerman case in a town north of Orlando. And Zimmerman was acquitted. But yeah, you see the connection there. Later, there was such an outcry over Marissa Alexander that she was eventually released. But that's just an example of stand your ground. The stand your ground law they have here in Florida, it doesn't apply to people of color.
Well,
he's successfully able to, as a perceived white man, say he stood his ground. But with Marissa Alexander, who didn't even kill anybody, didn't hurt anybody, who was a victim of abuse. Even her ex-husband went to the court, and testified and said, "Don't put her in jail. I was trying to kill her." And they still had sentenced her to 20 years because she wouldn't take a plea deal.
Well, it's because she defended herself from a man with a gun. I mean, that's very, very dangerous.
And she's an African American woman, by the way, Marissa Alexander. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can't allow certain people to defend themselves in a system that isn't democratic. Because if those people are allowed to defend themselves, that ruins your whole system.
This is how crazy stand your ground is. Take the racism out of it, right? Just the actual law, if you read it and how vague it is. So in the state of Florida, if I shoot somebody in the leg and I can't prove there was witnesses that say that it was unnecessary, right? And I can't prove that it was justified, I could go to prison for 20 years for shooting that person in the leg. Now, if I murder somebody and there's no witnesses, all I have to do is say, as if I was white, right, because others wouldn't be able to do it, but all you have to do is say, I felt threatened. Mm-hmm. And then stand your ground applies to you. So it actually justifies murder. Yeah. And when you wound somebody, you get less. You get more time.
Who else stands your ground aside? Who else is allowed to kill because they felt threatened?
The police.
So stand your ground is just another way of extending this unofficial vigilante terrorist authority to neo-Nazis.
I didn't think
you're giving every, because this is the way it's enforced, you're giving every able-bodied white man in the state the right to play cop and have the rights of a cop if he feels threatened.
Yeah.
And if you look at it that way, it takes you back to the well-organized militia that was usually used to kill indigenous people and lynch black people.
You know how I talk to people in the South, Matthew, and I'm sure you've had similar conversations about socialism without saying socialism, right? Because that's the last thing you want to say. I go to working class people and I talk to them and I said, wouldn't you like a society where the workers run everything, where you can determine the wage that you want to get? And 9 times out of 10, you talk to them about that. You talk to them about the corruption of the system. You talk to them about revolution, and they love it. But as soon as you say, okay, what's the economic system you're proposing because of the indoctrination, not just in the South, the United States in general, against socialism, then they're turned against it. But if you convince them enough, then maybe they'll accept socialism. But how are your conversations with people in that regard? Because
it's the same, Alex. The same. When you talk about the parts of socialism, agreement. Oh yeah, that makes sense. We should do that. Why don't we get the benefits that corporations and banks get? People see that. They know that the government's been picking winners and losers forever, but especially the last 50 years, say. And, they see that. But when you bring up exactly that word socialism, then it's just, it's the switch is flipped. Right?
Well, I tell you, there's socialism right now under capitalism, right? They benefit from a type of corporate socialism. And white capital benefits too.
I don't like to talk about corporate socialism that way. It's cartelism. It's a monopoly. It's corruption. Calling it socialism is not the association with socialism that we want.
In the context of convincing a working class person who's been indoctrinated in socialism, you could tell them, look, not every way socialism's ever been applied is good. There's authoritarianism. There's what corporations do. What we're proposing is a workers' democracy.
But I mean, you can skip out of all of that and you can skip ahead and just say we're proposing a workers' democracy and not even talk about socialism. I mean, there's no rule that says you have to use the word socialism.
Yeah, but if they look up your YouTubes, they're going to see you eventually talking about socialism. That could turn them off. You'd want to preempt them and explain what it actually means.
I try to do that several times. But I mean, really, I identify mostly these days as an anti-capitalist more than anything specific.
You're more of an anarchist, but of course, with you, that's even worse, right? You tell that to certain people, and they're like freaking out.
Yeah, no, you say you're anarchist, and yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really throws people for a loop when I say I'm a libertarian socialist, because then that in American lexicon that can't work.
We'll show them early videos of Chomsky back when he used to talk about that, right?
Yeah.
I always go faster than I always go further back than that. The first person to call himself a libertarian socialist was Bakunin. Mm-hmm. That's anarcho-syndicalism. That's where the American labor movement ultimately came from in its original roots.
Right. Yeah. No, but I'll tell you this: you can say the word socialism, and have it accepted or not be shock the person, not shock the person, not scare the person to a much greater degree than 10 years ago, right? And a much greater degree than 20 years ago. And compared to like as I grew up, right, and you guys grew up in the 80s or whatever, you couldn't say it at all. That
no. It was a big deal.
It is. And a lot of people, with the younger generation, they understand it. Because they can, when we were growing up, you couldn't have who was going to teach you about socialism? How are you going to find out about it unless you had like an older brother who'd gone to college or an older sister who had gone to a reading by somebody? You know what I mean? Like in the 80s, it wasn't really easy to learn. Now you can get on your phone and you go on YouTube and you can watch a Richard Wolff video or whoever.
I had a weird gay Maoist uncle. So there's that.
Yeah. You had an uncle who was a Maoist, you said?
I had a weird gay Maoist uncle. Yeah.
Interesting.
Right. I mean, if you went through public school, you went to, whatever, you're not gonna learn what socialism really was. Socialism was just the full name of the Soviet Union, which was communist. So those things were conflated.
Well, I'm 37. I remember reading about the Soviet Union in the newspaper when it was still around. When I was a kid, I used to like to read the paper. It's not that far back in history.
No, it's not. No, I was born in 1973, so I was 16 years old. When the wall comes down and everything else. I remember talking about it in social studies class, but still, the conversation was very narrow. And there was a prescribed understanding or definition of things.
Yeah,
but socialism wasn't even really discussed. It was always just communism. But again, socialism was just the Union of Soviet Socialists.
They still had a socialist economy in the Soviet Union. The problem was the lack of political freedoms, the influence of Stalinism and authoritarianism.
Oh, yeah.
They had what we call the federal jobs guarantee.
Yeah. But I have to get going, guys. It's 11 o'clock. I'm going to turn into a pumpkin.
The same
floors.
Yeah. We love having you on, Matthew.
I appreciate this, guys. I enjoyed it, and hopefully I can come back on some other time.
Absolutely. If you have any final thoughts or anything to promote before you go, just
let people know how they can reach you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. Matthew Hoh for Senate.org. Please donate if you can. We've got, as we talked about earlier, we've got a legal fight in state court and a legal fight in federal court. Plus, we have a campaign to run. So we're up against these Goliaths. And, we're taking on the Leviathan here. And so if people can support us, please donate, encourage others to donate. And if people want to volunteer and be a part of our campaign, you don't need to be here in North Carolina. We can use your help anywhere. Please go to MatthewHoferSenate.org. And, Alex, Chris, I appreciate this, guys. Thanks for having me.
Have a great night. Thanks.
All right. Okay, good night, guys.
Pleasure. I guess talk a few more minutes. I wanted to talk about elaborate a little more on the federal jobs guarantee.
Sure.
We had a little debate about this the other day. So UBI, I'm in favor of temporarily. I think a more permanent solution would be a federal jobs guarantee. And also the problem about the original UBI, which was concepted by the Cato Institute long before Yang and the Forward Party, is that it goes after welfare. I'm in favor of welfare. So I say keep welfare, have a temporary UBI for people to get back on their feet, and a raise of a federal minimum wage, along with the federal job guarantee for people that are not severely disabled to work, kind of a socialist economy. What's your take on that?
I think a federal jobs guarantee is a good idea. I also think you need a greatly expanded Social Security system
Mm-hmm.
I think you need a social wealth fund that actually pays American workers a slice of what capitalists make instead of the other way around.
Right, and also think about retaliation, right? Part of the reason why in France they rebel so much more than us is not that they have like a natural ability to rebel more than Americans, is that they have federal jobs guaranteed there. So they know that if they're retaliated against and they lose their job as a result of the protest, they're guaranteed immediately after another job.
There are very strict laws about retaliating against strikers in France, and the labor union's right to strike was very important to them, and they did not sign it away in contracts the way that American unions did, because while there's some degree of corruption, it's about 10 or 20 years behind the U.S.
Well, yeah. By the way, do we have any comments on the YouTube you want to share from anybody?
Yes, this is good. This is important. Trump was a terrible negotiator. Lots of people swindled the heck out of him and bragged about it.
The point I was trying to make was not that he's a skilled negotiator, but that because he comes from a business background, there were situations where he tended to try to have a discussion rather than just base it on ideology. Trump really didn't have an ideology. He was kind of fascist, but he was more opportunistic than anything, a fake populist.
No, and I agree with that. Obviously he wanted to make deals, even if he was bad at it and couldn't actually close the deal, like with Kim Jong-un. Right. I mean, he was right to want to try to make some sort of peace with North Korea. He just couldn't close the deal with anything that the North Koreans could actually agree to.
And you know very well that the heightened escalations, because there was escalations in the eastern provinces under Trump in Ukraine, but the heightened escalations that made it inevitable that Russia was going to invade, that wouldn't happen with the Trump 2.0. So in some ways, Biden's foreign policy is worse. Again, I'm not trying to say something good about Trump. I'm just saying because Biden's neoliberal ideology, he took part in those provocations, and there's been a lack of diplomacy.
It's important to note, though, that people like Mike Pompeo have admitted to totally ignoring Trump and going full tilt against Russia.
Yeah, he was a hardliner.
Yeah. And that's important to understand, that there were people, even in Trump's inner circle, who agreed with him on 90% of the things that he thought were important, were not behind him on his foreign policy. He was being undermined at every turn as far as trying to go soft on Russia. His administration was actually tougher on Russia than Obama's. So that was kind of a myth that was created by the media, which we all know now. On that note, I think I wish everybody a great night. I thank everybody for joining us. And Alex, of course, thank you. And everybody take care.
Peace.